Good afternoon. Welcome to Remaking the Economy, Closing the Wealth Gap, the Case for Reparations. I'm Steve Dubb, Senior Editor and Director of our Economic Justice Program at Nonprofit Quarterly, coming to you from Boston on land historically stewarded by the Massachusetts Nation. For this webinar, I'm honored to introduce our team of expert panelists who are Sandy Darity and Kirsten Mullen, a husband and wife team based in Durham who co-authored the award-winning book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, which was published just last year by UNC Press. Also here with us is Diedrich Asante Muhammad, who is Chief of Race, Wealth, and Community for the National Community Reinvestment Coalition, an economic justice group based in Washington, D.C. And last but not least, we have Gary Cunningham, CEO of Prosperity Now, a national nonprofit also based in Washington, D.C., whose focus is on building a fair and just economy that is free from structural inequity and racism. A few notes. First, we're very excited to take your questions. Other than the title slide, this webinar has no slides. We will start with a set of prepared questions and get to your questions. Please enter your questions into the question box at the bottom of the screen, and I will share as many of them with the panelists as I can. This webinar is free, but producing it is not. So if you like what we're doing and can support MPQ's racial and economic justice work, please consider making a donation today. We also encourage you to join the conversation via social media with our hashtag, Rebuild the Economy. Thanks so much for joining us, and please complete the brief survey after the webinar to inform our work. And with that, let's begin. And I thought I'd begin with Sandy and Kirsten, and if you could talk about the book and the proposal for reparations and what are the key elements of it.
Thank you very much, Steve. We're really pleased to be with you and this community today, and thank you so much for this invitation. So we want to talk about why the solution to the racial wealth gap must be reparations. Okay. So I'm going to talk about ARC, A-R-C. When we were conducting research for our recent publication, From Here to Equality, Sandy and I studied redress programs from around the world. After consulting several successful initiatives, national and international models for restitution, we crafted our own definition of reparations. For us, reparations are a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice, ARC, A-R-C. Acknowledgement requires good faith. What we're talking about here is a national act of declaration that a great wrong has been committed. Acknowledgement is achieved when the perpetrator and the beneficiaries of the atrocity or atrocities recognize and publicly admit their culpability. Redress is the remedy, the making it right act or acts of restitution for the grand crime by the perpetrator. Typically, redress takes one of two forms, restitution or atonement. In this case, the goal would be to restore the formerly enslaved to a condition they enjoyed prior to their enslavement. This is not possible for several reasons. Those individuals who are now, many people who were enslaved, all people who are now were enslaved are now deceased. And even if they were alive today, they would not have had the experience of a non-enslaved existence to which they could be restored. It is possible, however, to move their descendants toward a more equitable position had they not endured those injustices. So we focus on restitution as the appropriate form of redress rather than atonement because it's impossible to expect African Americans collectively to agree that sufficient steps have been taken to justify forgiveness. We have clear metrics for determining when restitution has been achieved that cannot be established for atonement. So what would restitution look like? True reparations would eliminate racial disparities in wealth, income, education, health, sentencing and incarceration, political participation, and subsequent opportunities to engage in American political and social life. We're talking about compensating Black American descendants of U.S. slavery for past repression and exploitation, while also dramatically decreasing the stubborn existing obstacles to full citizenship. True reparations would lead to a sharp and enduring reduction in racial disparities especially the Black-white gulf in wealth and a dramatic increase in Black well-being. Closure, perhaps the most controversial aspect of the reparations program we advocate, is the victim's agreement that the perpetrator has met the debt owed and no further claim made on the U.S. government unless, and this is critical, unless there is a renewal of the harm or imposition of a new harm. Closure requires mutual reconciliation between African Americans and the beneficiaries of slavery, legal segregation, and ongoing discrimination towards Blacks. We were talking yesterday about this term reconciliation that we actually do use in our book. And we say that, that was a mistake on our part. We should have said conciliation, because we haven't had the conciliation yet, so we can't be reconciled. So we're waiting for, the conciliation. But the project of reparations is a huge challenge, but one with great promise.
We are emphatic that the case for reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery is not limited to, although this was a horrific set of events, is not limited to slavery itself, but it must include two other phases in American history. The first phase that accompanies the period of slavery is the nearly century-long period of legal segregation in the United States, what we colloquially refer to as the Jim Crow period. And the Jim Crow period not only was one in which there were legal restrictions on the capacity of Black people to participate fully in social and economic life in the United States, but also it was a period that was accompanied by a wave of massacres that took place north, south, east, and west, upwards of about 100 of them that occurred between the end of the Civil War and the beginning of the 1940s. And these massacres, perhaps the most notable ones for most Americans, are the massacre that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921, and the earlier massacre that took place in Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898. These massacres were directed against communities in which Black people had begun to develop some measure of prosperity. And they resulted in the massive loss of Black lives, as well as the destruction and, in many instances, the appropriation of Black-owned property by the white terrorists. So that's the second phase that's relevant. The third phase that's relevant is the period in the aftermath of the passage of the civil rights legislation that, in principle, brings legal apartheid in the United States to an end. And that's a period in which we still encounter mass incarceration. We encounter police executions of unarmed Blacks. We encounter ongoing discrimination in employment, credit, and housing markets. And then, most significant from the standpoint of the framework that we offer in From Here to Equality, we have a massive disparity in wealth between Blacks and whites in the United States. Now, wealth is the difference between what you own and what you owe. It is distinct from income, which is primarily associated with your earnings in a given period of time. Wealth is the difference between the value of the assets that you possess and the debts that you incur. And in the United States in 2019, the Federal Reserve's estimates from their survey of consumer finances indicate that the disparity on average between Black and white wealth holders in the United States is approximately $840,000. This $840,000 gap in wealth per household translates into a situation where Black Americans who are descendants of U.S. slavery constitute about 13% of the nation's population, but only possess 2.5% of the nation's wealth. And we argue that this wealth differential is a consequence of policies that the United States has conducted that denied Black Americans of access to the opportunities for wealth accumulation and provided tremendous supports for white Americans to do so. And illustrations of this are 19th century land allocation policies, where Black Americans newly emerging from enslavement were denied a promised 40-acre land grant in restitution for their years of bondage, while white Americans in large numbers were receiving 160-acre land grants in the Western territories of the United States under the aegis of the Homestead Acts. And then in the 20th century, social policy for wealth accumulation was shifted to home ownership. And so we find in that period of time that we have the discriminatory application of the New Deal legislation and the GI Bill to the detriment of Black Americans and to the advantage of white Americans. And so we conclude in From Here to Equality that the central objective of a reparations plan must be elimination of the racial wealth difference in the United States, bringing the Black share of wealth into consistency with the Black share of the population, and this would require an expenditure of at least $10 to $12 trillion.
All right, thanks for laying that all out. Diedrich, I wanted to get you in the conversation, and I know you've written considerably about the racial wealth gap, and why is reparations so key to closing that racial wealth gap?
Yeah, I mean, and I'll kind of take it in an opposite way. I mean, oftentimes when I speak, I say the foundation of racial inequality is racial economic inequality, and the foundation of racial economic inequality is the racial wealth divide. So, I think it's important, to me, the importance of looking at racial wealth inequality in the context of larger racial economic inequality was to try to get at the substantive and concrete inequality that still exists today. Oftentimes you talk about racial inequality, people want to jump to race relations and how they need, more friends of different colors or, what have you, or depacking privilege. And that's fine. And there's important spaces for that. But I think, we need to look at kind of the material reality of a contemporary inequality. And I think that's best found in racial economic inequality, and the racial wealth divide is a great measure in that, because it really is, even more so than income, it's wealth that gives you the opportunity to, invest in a business or be a homeowner or get through a COVID crisis when maybe your business is shutting down and not have to lose your house at the same time, right? So, I believe this, racial wealth inequality is central. And if we're looking at reparations, reparations can mean a lot of things to a lot of people, and it usually does. Some people's ideas of reparations is having a national conversation on race, right? Or an apology about things, right? And I think apologies are important, then conversations are important, but a reparations that doesn't repair and that doesn't contemporarily repair the racial inequality that's existed in this country before its foundings is incomplete. And that's why I think it's essential that we look at whatever reparations package that is put forth. And I think reparations will be a host of things, right? It will be education. It will be hopefully some particular financial investments in individual households. It might be, even larger, multifaceted community things, strengthening Black colleges, strengthening Black institutions. But it has to address that inequality we see for the average African American as compared to white, if we really want reparations to repair.
Great, thanks, Diedrich. Gary, you've done a lot of work, and of course, Prosperity Now is focused on asset building. That obviously is another word for wealth building. Talk about how you think about asset building and how it connects to this conversation about reparations and the wealth gap.
Absolutely. And I am so, Steve, thank you for having me. And I'm so delighted to be on this panel with folks that I have high regard for. The book that Kirsten and Sandy have written is the case for reparations, without a doubt. And my good friend, Diedrich Asante Muhammad, we've worked on these issues for many years now. And so I'm just delighted to be here. Let me say this, that in addition to transfer of income for reparations, we also have to look at the systems and structures that African American people are operating in today. For example, if we look at how credit is allocated, how the credit score has been used as a mechanism to maintain what is, and to keep African Americans out of these systems of financial inclusion, if you will. So it's not just someone writing a check and providing reparation, I think the case for reparation has been made. The real question is, how do we get there from here? And so I would argue that not only do we need to reshape the repair that reparations will bring, we also need to reshape the institutions that African Americans reside in. Because if we leave those institutions unchanged, even with cash payments, the structures of the system will continue to have deleterious effect on African American people. You can go and look at this question, and Sandy raised it earlier. This whole country is set up on property, on ownership, on those that have and those that have not. And so if we don't create a system where African American people can own both property as well as businesses, as well as the ability to transfer wealth from generation to generation, that has to be part of the package when we talk about reparations, because if we leave the system that are in place, they will continue to treat African American people as second-class citizens in this country. If we look at, for example, Robert Putnam's new work, that Upswing that just came out, he actually documents the fact that African Americans are no better off today than we were economically in 1968. So despite all these changes, we end up in the same place. And what he attributes that to, and I actually agree with him, is the back whitelash that has occurred post-civil rights. And so if we're going to change the conditions, we can't just change the laws, we have to change the system itself.
Great, thanks, Gary. Diedrich, I just wanted to, I know you've done a lot of work on the wealth gap particularly, and maybe just talk about, this is sometimes, I thought the three stages that Sandy laid out were important, but, talk about the most recent stage in particular. I mean, there was, obviously over $1 trillion of household wealth lost from communities in color in the Great Recession. And so that's a theme I know you've written about extensively. How does that enter into the conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think an important thing to note is that oftentimes there's, there can be different stages of denial, right, of how white supremacist our country is. And one stage of denial is that, there's not that much of a difference between blacks, whites, Latinos, Asian Americans. We're all kind of in this together. I think more recently there's been a much wider acceptance of that there is deep inequality in this country. There's deep racial economic inequality and other types of inequality. So I think for many people, we understand there is some type of recognition, but a lot of people, even if they recognize there's some type of inequality, there's oftentimes this belief, we're not where we want to be, but we're getting there. And if we're just patient, we will get to that great equality space. But I think when you look at racial economic inequality and the racial wealth divide, you see quite clearly, like, we're not getting there. Like, the country is not on a path toward having, white, black, and Latino having equal median wealth. Oftentimes, we see this wealth in terms of dollar amounts growing. So without really a radical change in this country's policies, we are going to maintain deep racial economic inequality, right? So, and it's clear now, I mean, hopefully it's becoming more clear. I think people see, oftentimes they mistake symbols for substance, right? So a black president, oh, look, we're almost there with racial equity, right? Or, a black woman, South Asian vice president. Oh, look, we're almost there toward racial equality. But you look at the substance, like how much did median wealth change between blacks and whites in terms of equity? It wasn't in a good way under the Obama administration. I don't see a lot of substantive bridging happening under the Biden administration. That's not to blame Biden Obama. I would just look at since 83, where we have good data, we're not on a path of bridging this inequality. So I think, the recognition of racial wealth divide, and that generally African Americans have had twice the unemployment rate of whites since the 1963 March on Washington for freedom and jobs. Like, the country's not getting there. We have to have radical changes in policies, and part of this would be reparations.
Great, that's really helpful. Thanks. Kirsten, I know you referred to this, that you did, you looked at reparations efforts across the world and including, past reparations efforts in the US, like with Japanese Americans who were interned in concentration camps during World War II. What can we learn from those past examples?
There's a lot to be learned from them. Some steps to take and steps to avoid. In the case of Japanese Americans, as you said, this was the situation in which the U.S. wrongfully incarcerated basically Japanese Americans during World War II, in a fit of war hysteria and racism. And ultimately, the United States admitted that it had acted unlawfully. And so in 1988, the United States began to pay reparations to Japanese Americans who had been interned, some of them, upwards of 4 or 5 years. So several lessons from that process. Japanese Americans had already in existence an organization called Japanese American Citizens League, which lobbied Congress on their behalf over several decades. Interestingly, the tougher case at the time was with the House and not with the Senate. But ultimately, they were very fortunate to have had 2 incredible, leaders and allies in the Senate and 2 in the House who, fought tirelessly to bring about reparations. The decision was to make reparations available only to individuals who had actually been interred initially. So these were folks who, in 1988, you had a whole generation of people who had not had this experience, but their parents and grandparents had that experience. So about 117,000 Japanese Americans received $20,000 for their having been interned, right, in these camps across the United States, these sort of remote camps. But the payments were made. They were uniform payments, and they were made directly to the individuals. So those are 2 really important things. And this whole idea, too, of having this grassroots movement matched with a high-level lobbying effort really did turn the key for Japanese American reparations. Interestingly and importantly, you had a number of Black legislators and Black organizations that also were supportive of their initiative. I learned recently from John Tateshi, who was one of the architects of the Japanese redress movement, that Ron Dellums was one of the many people who provided testimony and talked about his childhood friend, I think his name was Ronald, who was a Japanese American who lived in his neighborhood, and how he actually was standing in the street when the vehicles came to evacuate his friend's family to intern them in these camps. We also looked at the case of the Jews across Europe who had been subjected to the Holocaust. And slightly different case in that, reparations came a little closer to the period when the harms had been inflicted. But you had a large number of people in several different countries who had been affected by this. You had the creation of Israel, and you had this state of Israel arguing on behalf of the Jews, which was also a very different kind of arrangement than we have with Black reparations. There's no African nation yet that has said we will back this notion. I mean, we've wondered what it would be like if individual African countries or the continent as a whole came together and said, absolutely, the U.S. government should pay reparations to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, and we support that. And we will not allow, any new American operations to come, to the continent and do business until the U.S. Makes good on this promise to Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So in the case of the Jews, individuals were given reparations, not of identical amounts. There was like a base amount, but if you were able to demonstrate, for example, that your property was worth X amount, then and it was taken from you, whether it was art or a house, any kind of assets, then those individuals received even larger amounts of reparations. Interestingly, in the last decade, the trend has been to increase the number of Jews who are eligible to receive reparations. We know that as recently as 2012 and 16, Jews who were in other countries, in France, for example, who were remanded to Germany, became eligible to receive reparations when they had not been so before. And also the amount of time that one had to prove that they had been forced to live in a ghetto has been reduced, initially from 18 months down to 12, and then ultimately to 6. So, the idea has been of one of more generosity to these individuals, making it, to broaden the reasons why reparations would qualify. I'm sorry, and also to think about the sustenance these individuals need. We could talk also about 9/11 and some other cases as well, but those are two I think that are really, really important when you're talking about Black American reparations.
Great, thanks. Sandy, I wanted to ask you about there's these different efforts at state and local reparations, and do those efforts, like the city of Asheville or Evanston, they're various ones, right? Do they boost the movement for national reparations, or do they in some ways detract from it?
My thinking is that it would be beneficial if localities and state governments combine to form a coalition to petition Congress and to lobby Congress for a comprehensive national reparations program. That what happens at the local level is something that can be of great value, but I think it's inappropriate for the language of reparations to be applied to those local initiatives. What localities are typically doing is reversing a history of harmful policies. And reversing a history of harmful policies is not the same thing as compensating for the harm. The compensation for the harm that's required for living descendants of Blacks who were enslaved in the United States, the compensation for that harm must take the form of addressing the enormous racial wealth differential, which captures the intergenerational cumulative effects of the operation of structural racism in the United States over many, many years. And so as a consequence, we don't think that it's possible for states and localities to actually meet that test. Keep in mind that the estimate that we offered earlier in our conversation today was that the bill for reparations to eliminate racial wealth differences in the United States would require $10 to $12 trillion at minimum. The combined budgets of all state and local governments taken together is approximately $3.1 trillion. And if all of those funds were devoted to the reparations effort, then we would still have a shortfall of at least $7 trillion. And if all of those funds were devoted to the reparations effort, states and localities would not have the capacity to provide any of the services that they are customarily obligated to perform. And so I think we have to be proprietary about the use of the term reparations. It's not applicable to what states and localities can do individually or collectively, but it is applicable to what the federal government can do and should do with respect to meeting a debt that has not been paid for 156 years.
Thanks. And of course, too, I mean, there's something called the Federal Reserve that prints money, and that's at the federal level. So, the capacity is only at the federal level.
Let me just add, the response to the Great Recession in terms of congressional funding and the response to the pandemic in terms of federal funding indicates that the federal government does indeed have the capacity to engage in expenditure for almost any project that we can imagine. The only limitation from our perspective is whether or not the new expenditure would trigger high rates of inflation. And so one of the things that we try to do in the pages of From Here to Equality is to outline a plan for reparations where we make sure that we minimize the inflation risk.
Yeah, maybe say a little bit about that, but you envision it over 20 years, right? Am I getting that right?
No.
Yeah, okay, sorry. That's
No,
why
I
I
mean,
asked.
we would like to
Yeah.
see, the gap close within a decade, and even
Okay.
shorter would be better, but absolutely no more than 10 years.
But we figure that
Yeah.
a decade, if you spread the spending out over the course of the decade, you would greatly reduce the prospects of an inflationary outcome.
And
Okay,
the
so-
20 years is probably my piece. I did
okay.
reparations for $20,000 a year for 20 years. See, this couple's much more ambitious in how they're going to bridge the racial wealth divide.
So 10 years, not 20 years. Got
Yeah,
it.
And we're a lot older also.
Gary, I want to go ahead.
We have to do this within our lifetime. I mean,
Yeah.
we can't
Yes,
have
yes.
a generation for these harms to be corrected and addressed. But there is some issues that need to be overcome. And so while I agree with Sandy and Kirsten on the issue of that it needs to be addressed at the federal level, I do think we have to build the movement necessary at the state and local level, particularly with advocates on the ground that are going to build this movement. It's not just going to be some magic thing that happens in Washington because someday somebody wakes up and says, oh, we made this mistake. There's going to have to be concerted pressure. And I would argue that the local efforts actually have the seeds of that ability to build this movement at that level. If you look at Emmanuel Pasteur's work on movement building, or you look at the other work that's been done, you look at the National Rifle Associations. We have 90% of Americans believe that we should do something about gun control, but they actually have such a force that we haven't been able to make that to happen. Or if you look at what's happening with the right to marry who you love, those movements actually came from local folks with a national agenda that actually pushed through this work over time to make those things happen. So when you look at national movements to make things happen, we have to build the infrastructure on the ground so that those folks in Washington that come back to their home states actually hear about the need and the necessity to do something now about reparations. So I would argue that we should take advantage and we should work with, we should be supporting, we should be incubating, we should be helping to organize those local movements with data and information so that we can actually build the movement that's necessary, that when this comes to fruition in Washington, there's no question that there's huge amount of pressure to make this happen. So that's what I would argue. As a former community organizer, that's what I would say.
Let me say, we absolutely, don't object to local movements at all. We simply believe that the work that they're doing should not be called reparations. We need all of these groups to make the case. It's like a both and, work on your local initiatives, work on your racial equity, projects, but also advocate for a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. We're just, our concern is that we not label all of these projects reparations, that we reserve that title for the national program so that they're separate. I mean, we don't want to run the risk of individuals saying, oh, you've got this program in Evanston, you've got this program in Asheville, you've got this program in California. Why do you need reparations? You've already got that. So I think it's been helpful to just be really clear and to say what you mean and be very distinct. But absolutely, yes, we do think that you need all of these individuals to make the case. When you think about other movements that have succeeded in the United States, they were individuals were the ones who started, and whether they organized through small groups that became connected through chapters. I mean, this is exactly what happened with the Japanese American Citizens League.
Which is modeled after
the NAACP, right? I mean, but they had chapters all across the country, and as they were building momentum, and trying to reach consensus, they had a number of conversations and also sent out surveys, to the membership trying to find, where is the common ground? What are the points that we can all agree on so that we can have this united front when we're talking about a reparations initiative. And so that's what we're talking about. Yes, we agree with you. Absolutely. You need all of these groups. We have probably, between us, spoken to over 100 local groups all over the country, and try to share our thoughts and listen to their concerns, in an effort to build the kind of consensus that you're talking about. But there is no single organization that I'm aware of yet, that has stepped forward and said, we will shepherd this movement, all the way to the end. We will be there when the legislation is passed. That's what we need.
Kirsten, this was actually a question from the audience. Are there actually, are you seeing some of the chapters that you're calling for actually emerging? I know there hasn't been a national organization, but sort of local reparations organizations of the kind that you were writing about in the book.
Absolutely. I can speak of one city. So Durham, North Carolina, the city council unanimously passed a resolution that advocates for a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. It's the only one that we know of so far in the country. But interestingly, that resolution identifies the eligible recipients of reparations, and it talks about Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. So these are people who are descendant from at least one person who was enslaved in the United States, and who self-identify as Black, African American, Afro-American, or Negro, and have done so at least 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations study commission or the enactment of a reparations program. It speaks to the elimination of the racial wealth gap as one of the main goals of a reparations program. People will say, if you're just talking about writing a check, we need these structural changes. $850,000 on average given to each Black household. That is a structural change. But the third piece in the in Durham, North Carolina's City Council resolution is the focus on those payments going directly to the eligible recipients. So, cities, communities, book clubs, all of these groups could, contact the Durham, North Carolina City Council and request a copy of that document. Change Durham City Council, put your own organization's name in there and send it on to Congress. There are all kinds of ways that we can, actify, that we can, jump in. We don't have to wait for, some magic moment. This is something that can be done right now. But we would say, yes, focus on your local initiatives while simultaneously advocating, lobbying, and petitioning Congress for a national program.
Great, thanks. So one of the more popular audience questions, has to do, I guess it was a recent executive order by President Biden that acknowledged housing discrimination at the federal level. So the question is, is this, how do you build on that opening? I know there's going to be hearings shortly on, I think, the latest iteration of House Resolution 40. There's some initial movement at the federal level. It certainly hasn't reached close to actual reparations, but how do we build on the energy that's existing?
This is Diedrich. I will start off just by saying, I do think it is important that we build on this. And I think it's important that we, state that, we believe, different organizations, individuals believe in reparations. Like, we need that call out there. I was involved in some politics around the Biden transition. And even though sometimes it was said, don't bring up reparations, the advocates there said, well, we're going to bring up, we're going to say there should be reparations. And then the Biden administration can, decide which way they want to go. So I think it's very important that national organizations, local organizations, community organizations all say, yes, we believe in reparations. We want to move these things forward. Because I think, we haven't had a clear national call that this is something that, even just the Democratic Party or, local Democratic parties or Republican parties would be great too, or Green parties, all these things. So to really make it a national call, kind of like what happened with like Black Lives Matter, like reparations matters, right? And that we're going to stand for it. So I think, one, just bringing voice to that. But I think Yeah, I think some other panelists have maybe some more specific ideas, particularly around, there are some things like HR 40, which I know we have some critiques on, that are being pushed forward, and maybe we can talk a little bit about that and how that should be strengthened.
Yeah, and I'd like to say, Sheila Jackson Lee at the House yesterday held a hearing on the study, to create the study that's been circulating since 1989, for us to have this study of reparations. And I just want to applaud her in the work that she and others in Congress are doing to lift this up and put it on the table. And they need our support now. So all you in the audience that actually believe in this, I ask you to actually write your congressperson and your senator to say that this is an important issue for you. Because if we don't really actually get behind the movement around HR 40 now, that is the only game in town right now for reparations in this country writ large. But I'd also like to say that we've got some hurdles to overcome. One is Prosperity Now and the Other and Belonging Institute in October of last year did a national poll. And while these numbers have improved somewhat, they're still 24%, only 24% of whites support reparations, where our poll also shows that 71% of African Americans support reparations and 44% of Latinx folks support reparations. So we've got some work to do in framing this issue, and framing it in a way that we can change hearts and minds around it, in part because that's where the rubber meets the road, is actually changing the trajectory of this country. We've seen significant change in attitudes about race since Mr. Floyd was killed and so many others by police. But we have a ways to go to reframe this question so that we can, in our lifetimes, address the issue of reparations for African Americans and close completely this wealth divide that we have in this country for African American people.
I'd like to offer a friendly pushback a bit on this, because I think that HR 40 is grossly flawed. And I'm going to put a couple of opinion pieces in the chat in a moment about HR 40. But I think it's a detour away from true reparations rather than necessarily a route towards true reparations. And this is in large measure because the legislation does not compel the commission that's supposed to be established to generate a set of proposals that would have three attributes. First, that the proposal should specify that Black American descendants of U.S. slavery are the eligible recipients. Second, that the proposal must necessarily set as a priority closing the racial wealth gap. And third, that the proposal must necessarily indicate that the eligible recipients will receive payments directly from the federal government. And insofar as those three characteristics are not built into the directive that the commission would receive from HR 40, I think that we are probably going to be looking towards the commission generating a report that's going to be quite shallow and empty of content. And so at the present moment, I think our position is that HR 40 needs to either be revised or be replaced altogether, because it's not going to be an avenue towards true reparations in the United States.
So we would ask, that individuals, look at these two op-eds, and take a look at HR 40, for yourself before you write your letters to your congresspersons. And we hope that you will, decide that that letter should say, yes, I support a national program of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery, but HR 40 is not going to get us there.
Is there something else in play that you're aware of?
Yes.
So there definitely are, several groups that are working to create alternative legislation.
there's a team in California that has created what they're calling HR 1865,
yes,
which is a complete revision, a thorough revision of HR 40. Yeah,
and it has 3 basic tenets that we have been talking about.
It was a state program or a state approach, right?
No. That's just where they're based. That's just where
they're based in California, but they've written a piece of legislation that hopefully Congress would consider and adopt. Yeah.
Right.
And I'll just put forward. I'll just put forward on this, and then go back to the questions. I think historically, the last 40 something years, HR 40, I said 40 years, but HR 40 has been kind of the main piece of legislation that has even brought up this idea of reparations. So I think for that, it is important, but I think, and again, that's why my general call is, let's demand reparations. And my overall thing with HR 40 was the idea that it was pulling together, some type of conversation around what reparations should be. But I think there's other legislative pieces that are put forward, in its stead. And, I haven't read the op-ed pieces that Sandy's put forward yet, but look forward to doing it. But I think the main thing is that, there needs to be this conversations happening in Congress, and let people know that this actually is something people are seriously looking at. We can see how to move it forward.
Yeah, I think we included an article, Sandy.
I think most of us are just not accustomed to reading legislation. I know I'm certainly not. And, you think, oh, these are politicians who I generally support. Of course, this is something that is positive. I think, but the other point I think I want to make is, HR 40 has been a placeholder for 30 years. And we know a lot more about what will make a difference in the lives of Black people than we did in 1989. There's much more data about the racial wealth gap. There's much greater understanding of our history. Certainly there's more work to be done. But, we have a better sense of how we got to here. And a lot of it falls at the feet of the U.S. government. Either policies that the United States government put in place, or, circumstances where the U.S. government did not do its job and allow, Black Americans of U.S. slavery to suffer. And to create a situation where they didn't benefit from these laws and these programs that white Americans had access to.
And the government looking the other way is particularly true with respect to the massacres that took place.
Absolutely. So, So on the one hand, is a call to all of us to be more engaged in the political process. And certainly we're not going to be, I'm not suggesting or even, thinking that it's likely that we will be reading all of the legislation that's coming out of Congress. But this is legislation that is really important. And I think this is one of those cases where it's worth your time to take a look at it and see what exactly HR 40 calls for and the deficiencies in that legislation.
Yeah, and nothing's perfect. One, I want to say I have the utmost respect for both of you. I haven't read these articles that you're talking about, so I will take a look at them. And as a descendant of folks that died in Tulsa, is where my people are from, I can tell you that this issue in Tulsa is a hot issue right now that we're actually facing. And clearly, the issue of HR 40, it might not be perfect, but I am actually trying to move an agenda, and that agenda is reparations in this country. So part of it is the question. Again, I haven't read your pieces, and I always take your work serious. I've known Sandy for some time, or known of your work for sure. But I also would say that supporting the work that's going on, knowing that it may need to be corrected, it may need to be changed, it may need to be, that's what the art of politics is the art of the possible and the
Absolutely.
art of the compromise, so that we can get somewhere. Because if we stay stuck in our place and we don't move forward on something, our people suffer. And I don't want to see another generation of Black people in this country living out the same legacy that we've had today. So I don't think we're different or we're saying something different. But I do think we agree on the main point here. But I do want to say that I want to lift up those people that continue this fight, and I want to lift up those folks that are doing both at the local level in all of the work that folks are doing locally and at the national level. And so I certainly would say that there needs to be some amendments and changes, and I certainly will look at that. And I think I encourage everybody to look at that. But at the same time, let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater, and let's try to move forward an agenda that reparations happen in our lifetime.
Let me ask a couple quick questions. I mean, there's a ton of questions from the audience. And there also are a lot of support materials, including a couple articles from Kirsten and Sandy that you guys will get after the webinar. But Gary, one question that I think is sort of a Gary question is about, I mean, anyone can respond to this, but it was, thoughts on baby bonds as one element, not as the sole element, but as one element of a reparations approach. Obviously this is something that's been proposed by Cory Booker from New Jersey.
Well, I think we need to give Sandy Darity some credit for coming up with the concept of baby bonds. In fact, I was with him many years ago when he talked about baby bonds and what it meant. And I have become a believer, an advocate, and someone that is a true supporter. And Prosperity Now clearly is on the side, because what we see in baby bonds is a long-term impact on building assets across this country. I also like the idea because it's universal in its approach and targeted in its framework. And so if we're going to have something in this country that works, we know that because of white backlash that has happened for every piece of legislation that has happened for Black people, there's been this backlash, that we actually need to frame this in a targeted universalist way. Meaning the goals, we all have the same goals of getting to prosperity, but not everybody's situated to opportunity in the same way. So baby bonds and the way that it's structured, the way that Senator Booker has structured it along with others, it really creates the conditions by which we could have a magnitude change in this country by making investments in our babies.
And if I could just jump in real quick, I mean, I wanted to distinguish between baby bonds and reparations, right? Even racial wealth divide and reparations. I think reparations can be an important part of bridging the racial wealth divide, but you can start bridging the racial wealth divide and it not be through a reparations program. And baby bonds, as Cory Booker's putting forward, is a universal program. It's a great program. It might help bridge some racial wealth divide, but that's not reparations, right? Just like a fair Social Security or like a $15 minimum wage. Those aren't reparations. Those are good policies that should be helpful to all people, and maybe even disproportionately impacts Blacks, Latinos, Native Americans, but it's not reparations. Reparations be targeted on those who have, generally ancestors enslavement, who have been Black, who've been dealing with these issues. So we shouldn't confuse the two, but I'll let,
Yeah, well, I guess, I am actually one of the two architects of the baby bonds proposal. And I'm very much of an enthusiast for the baby bonds proposal.
Of your idea. You're very much an enthusiast really. Of your idea.
but I've been a bit disturbed, and maybe it's my own work that helped promote this perspective, but I've been a bit disturbed by the view that some people have offered that baby bonds constitutes a substitute or an alternative to reparations, where from my perspective, it's always been the case that we should have both. And baby bonds is a proposal that is intended to create the equivalent of a trust account for every newborn infant in the United States, whereas a reparations project is intended to meet a national debt that has remained unpaid for 156 years. So they're not the same things. But I will also add that, in running the numbers on the impact of baby bonds, a fully executed baby bonds program, which would require a period of at least 40 years from the point at which it started, because individuals received these trust accounts in infancy and they cannot access them until they're in young adulthood. So if we were looking 40 years down the road from the inauguration of a baby bonds proposal, given its structure, the best that it could do is raise the Black share of wealth in the United States from about 2.5% to somewhere in the vicinity of 4%. And so we would still fall approximately 9 percentage points short of the goal of getting the Black share of wealth to 13%.
And if I could, Sandy, I agree with everything you just said. I don't think it's a substitute at all, and that we should be using these interchangeably. I do think that while we're working on reparations, we should be making other investments at the same time. For example, I'm working with 44 African-American-led CDFIs to transform capital access in America through the African-American CDFI Alliance. It is critical, important right now in this moment, that we ensure that we get resources to Black-owned businesses across this country. It is critical that we actually address in the short term some of the deep-end needs that have been created, not just because of the pandemic, but which has exacerbated the issues for capital flow for Black-owned businesses in our community, but this issue of baby bonds and other appropriate policies that are necessary to address the issue of the economic inequalities that we have in America. So it's not just waiting until we get baby bonds. We've got to act now on these other issues because there is a crisis for African Americans in this country that has been exacerbated by COVID. And so all I can say is that we've got to work on a multi-pronged strategy. This is not a one-size-fits-all, and we get done with it. African Americans in this country have what they call cumulative causations of issues, so that it's not one thing, it's multiple things. And so if we're going to have something that's going to address and address the playing field for Black people, we've got to work on multiple fronts, from medical and health to wealth, et cetera. And so that we need to work on all of those things.
Right. You're muted.
Yeah, I wanted just to say something about that. It's interesting. Listening to Gary's arguments here, we're not in disagreement. I had a good conversation with the mayor of Durham, North Carolina, Steve Schewel, and I said, Steve, help me understand, why, in the context of, the need for a national initiative, so many cities are putting forth these local initiatives. And he said, Kirsten, we want to act. We want a program that we can control. And, if it's a city level program, if it's a racial equity program, that's something that we can define. It's something that we can plan for and we can execute. We want something that's ours. And so I get that. But, we talk from Here to Equality about a quote from Malcolm X from an interview that he gave in 1964. And he talks about, how, if someone, thrusts a knife 9 inches into his back, and you pull that knife out 3 inches, that provides some level of relief. But the knife is still in your back. And then you pull out 3 more inches and you feel a little bit more, like you might survive, but still there's this open wound. And then even if you pull the knife completely out, you still have this open wound to be healed. And so, these kinds of programs like, doing Social Security right, making Black people eligible for fair housing. This is like the 3 inches or the 6 inches, or cities opening up their contracts to, Black people. I just was reading an article in the Boston Globe that, Boston has let fewer than 1.5% of its contracts to Black corporations. And I think for Latinos, it was something like 1.8%. Let those contracts, let those opportunities, let the seats on your commissions and your committees look like your population. For us, that's doing what you should have done in the first place. That's pulling the knife out. That's not reparations. So, it's a both and situation. Both and.
Trying to be cognizant of time here. We have like 1 minute left.
Thanks,
so
Steve.
if you could just, otherwise I'd love to have you guys go on, but just maybe last second, maybe 15 seconds each, so unfair timeline. But is there one ask you would make of nonprofits or philanthropy in terms of reparations?
I'll jump in. Take a public stand saying that the country needs reparations for African Americans. I think that's very important. And one other thing I'll add is, too, again, people want one answer. We want reparations, that's clear, but you're still going to need greater racial equity in all of your public policies. Even we get reparations, we don't want procurement for African-American businesses after reparations to still be only 2% for contracts, right? So we need both, like as we were saying, both and. We need all of these things. But go ahead, it would be great if all these nonprofits took a stand and said, we believe that this country needs reparations as part of the solution to dealing with the racial inequality we're wrestling with today.
And I'll just say, Steve, as usual, Diedrich said it so well. But I think we have to move beyond just being anti-racist and be pro-Black in all other policy. We need to be pro-Black, and that's not just being anti-racist. That's saying that you're going to positively affirm the strength and identity of Black folks in everything that we do in these corporations and these places. And unless we get there, we're going to continue to have the issues we have.
All right, Kirsten, Sandy, get the last word here.
We just applaud what was just said by both Diedrich and Gary.
All right. I want to, obviously we just got started. Maybe there'll be a sequel at some point. Clearly there's a lot of, we got to as many questions as we could. There's some great questions that we weren't able to get to, but I want to thank our panelists, Diedrich Asante Mohammed, Gary Cunningham, Sandy Darity, and Kirsten Mullen for amazing discussion. Thanks so much for all your excellent questions, and we'll be following up. There's a survey, please complete it. We look forward to hearing from you and remaining in conversation as we continue this Remaking the Economy series. Thanks so much.